Hey everybody, Patrick Kirby here from Do Good Better Consulting, and welcome to another guest expert training. And we have a wonderful one for you today. In fact, I guarantee that 99.9% of you have not thought about this subject or discussed this subject internally, and boy, you better. And I bet you will at the end of this, because we've got an incredible guest today. You may recognize his handsome face and his baritone voice as the play-by-play announcer of the NDSU Bison, also on the Midco Sports Network. But did you know he also is an expert in crisis management and social media things? Because I didn't until a week ago. Brian Shawn, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. How are you doing today? Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I
am excited about this. I think it's a topic that is so timely, especially with the internet kind of the way it is, and us sort of exploring nonprofit opportunities to kind of connect with donors online. But what happens if you don't have a plan put in place? And I'm really ecstatic for you to be here. So thank you so much.
No, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of your background. We know you from sports, but let's talk a little bit about why we're talking about crisis management in social media stuff, because I think that is fascinating.
You know, it's interesting, Patrick. You feel like you know everything, right? When you go through your professional life, you feel like, okay, I got this down. And then you go to work for an organization that responds to things in real time, that are crazy situations that are always changing. You realize, wow, there are a lot of things I did not know before I got involved in this situation.
Yeah.
And working for the American Red Cross kind of brings that to you. No disaster is ever the same as the next. No situation's ever the same as the next. The parts are always moving. You're relying on a lot of volunteers to get work done.
Yeah.
So once I got into training for the American Red Cross with the Advanced Public Affairs team, that's where I started to really pick up a lot of this on talking points and how you handle yourselves with the media in certain situations, because things happen so quickly, and if you're not prepared for them, you can really get yourself caught in the bind.
I think that is really wonderful background, and especially just on the fly, like practicing, like what are you going to say right away? What are your answers? It's same thing in the nonprofit world, where if somebody, donor comes up or a volunteer comes up and they ask a question, well, you better have some answers. So I'm really excited to talk about this. So let's start with crisis. Let's talk about an emergency example of where maybe a nonprofit or an organization has something that goes haywire. All hell breaks loose for something, and they're looking for how to respond. Where do you start? That I think is really the mystery, because we need to prep, but where do you start? Let's kind of reverse engineer all this kind of stuff.
Well, I think it's always important to talk about, okay, number one, what is our mission? Mm-hmm. What is our mission statement? What are the things that we're known for? What are the things that we do? So it's always important that you recognize, first of all, who we serve, why we do it, what we do it. Everybody should know the answers to those things.
Right.
And what are some places that we are maybe a little susceptible or a little bit in danger if something goes wrong, on people getting upset with something that we do or don't do, as we're trying to serve that specific kind of clientele. Mm-hmm. So you always have to think ahead of some things that may not go as planned, and how you're going to respond to a lot of those things. Right. And I think as a nonprofit, we're all doing the work because we love it, because we really want it to make a difference in the community and make a difference to the people we're helping. But all it takes is one person that isn't satisfied with the care you're giving, and all of a sudden, between social media or word of mouth, mm-hmm. or just the regular media, you can really find yourself on the defensive in a hurry. So I think it's always important to talk about what situations could arise to make sure that we're prepared for them when they come up.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you can take that in a negative context. We're like, oh God, now we got to think about all the things that could go wrong. But really, a spin on that would be, if you're prepared on mission and on point, non-talking points, you can actually talk about all the amazing positive things you do in situations that aren't crisis, because you've already prepared for a crisis, and then that's the same talking points, your same mission, same goals, same dreams, same hope, same impact. That helps you in every other facet of your industry or your nonprofit work. But this actually helps you prepare for things that you don't ever expect to happen by any stretch of the imagination.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things too, Patrick, where we're all human beings and we're all organizations, whether we work in the private sector, in the governmental sector, in the nonprofit sector.
Mhm.
There are times that things do go wrong, and there are times that there are misses. And sometimes it's okay to admit, you know what, we did miss this. Here's what we're doing to rectify the situation. And people, if you own it and recognize it is your mistake, when it is your mistake, that's okay to do that and talk about, here's why it got missed. Here's what we're going to do in the future to make sure this doesn't happen again. But if it's not your mistake, it's important to explain why the process works the way it does, because people don't always come to the nonprofit or to the organization and say, I'm unhappy. They immediately just take to social media because it's easier just to vent on their Facebook or Twitter or on Instagram. And then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, what happened here? And I didn't even realize there was a problem until someone pointed this out to me. So that's where this digital age, especially in the last 10 years, has really changed things.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful point. All right, so let's talk prep work. Let's just say you're starting from scratch, because I know you are. Let's say you're starting from scratch as an organization to prep just in case something happens or in any situation. What's the first thing that you would suggest that an organization does or gets to the point with right out of the gate just to start?
I think it's important to just develop talking points right away.
Yeah.
What are things that we do talk about? What are things that we don't talk about? I think that's probably equally as important too. You should have a half page of a sheet that are your talking points and things that we talk about, why we talk about those things, and why it's important for us to talk about those things. And then the other half of that sheet needs to be talk about things that are off base, that we do not talk about because there are security measures involved, or there are confidentiality measures involved, or some other issues that those are things that we just can't go on the record with.
Right.
I think people will often get themselves in trouble because they talk about something they shouldn't over talking about something they should. So I think that's why it's always equally important to talk about things and topics that we just cannot speak to. Yeah. And if you can't speak to them, it's okay to say, I can't speak to that for this reason.
Yes.
And you're okay with that.
Yes.
It's when you step into it and cross the line where your backtracking gets to be much more of a challenge.
It's okay to say, I don't know, but let me get you into front of somebody who does, or let me get you an answer that is the right one so that we can get this straight in a quick manner.
I always say the best line to learn anytime you're giving an interview, anytime you're trying to go on the defensive, on the offensive is, I can't speak to that, but here's what I can speak to.
I can't speak to that, but.
I can't speak to that, but here is what I can speak to. And then you can give the talking points of things you can talk about. And if people ask and keep pressuring you, why, just simply give the reasons. Here's the reasons, why. And it's okay to mention those reasons because ultimately everybody has to follow their rules, their laws, how things are going, whether it's a city law, a state law, a federal law, or whether it's just your own mission about why you can't share certain things. It's just important to know what those things are until everybody is comfortable speaking to those things.
Right. And what a nice twist, too. I mean, you can get the talking points that you want to convey, you can easily transition to there as well. I mean, you see a lot of politicians do this. You see a lot of athletes do this. I'm sure you've seen this in as both a reporter and an announcer and sort of an interviewer on sports teams in general. You're going to say, I want to talk about this particular thing, and then they pivot. And you've already lost the ability to kind of that gotcha piece because they've been prepped and they've trained on what to say and what they want to get out to the media.
Absolutely. There are people that are really good at it. And there are people that I think sometimes people will try to put you in a corner where they say, well, people think this. So what is your response? And you can say, I don't think people think that. Here's why I don't think people think that. So it's one of those things where you don't want a false narrative to come before the question is asked. And if it is, it's okay to squash that before you give your response as well. Yeah. It's just important to recognize that depending on the reporter, depending on the situation, how you want to respond.
Sure. That's awesome. Okay. So first step, get your talking points, get your things you want to get out there, things that you never want to talk about unless you have some CEO or executive director or board chair or who is ever authorized to talk about that. Lawyer, probably a good one.
Yeah.
get those lists. And then what's the next step? I would imagine training is super important on making sure that staff who are involved with people who may ask questions or are curious about an organization or a group should be trained fairly regularly on this and update those talking points often.
No question. That's a super important statement that you just made. You talk about training, how it's important that everybody that represents the organization, whether it's the highest of the level or the lowest of the level, at least still knows how to respond in case a situation arises. And I think the other part of that is anybody that answers phones regularly, anybody that is sitting at a front desk regularly, that has first contact, it's important for them to understand what they can and cannot say to people initially, because all of a sudden you can find yourself in a situation that people aren't necessarily knowing the answers to things and they say the wrong thing. And then all of a sudden now everybody's scrambling and trying to catch up. So I think training is really important, just based on what people are allowed to talk about. And then if they're not allowed to answer that question, transferring them to someone who is, and understanding you have a calling tree of certain topics. Okay, if it's about this topic, these two people need to speak to it. These two people need to speak to it. And then you have to make the determination, I think too, Patrick, of if you're a volunteer-driven organization, are you comfortable having some of your volunteers speak on the record for you if you're not represented in some of the communities,
right?
Staff members, do you want to do that? Are you comfortable doing that? If you're on the scene of something, if you are somewhere, are those people allowed to speak? And if they are, what are they allowed to say and what are their titles? And all those sorts of things. Those are determinations you have to make as nonprofits rely more and more on volunteers. The nice thing about volunteers and people that are there for the right reasons is they're very authentic. So they're great to use for interviews in those situations. But if it's a crisis, it's a very different situation because it impacts the entire organization, maybe not even locally, but on a state or even national level. So that's where you have to kind of abide to the rules of your governing body on how you want to handle that.
Yeah. And, I think you made a really wonderful point too about training those who are answering phones and their frontline offense. And then if you've got one or two paid staff members that you direct everything to them, or the ones who have authority to. And I think a lot of small and medium-sized nonprofits who don't have a dedicated marketing person would find this crisis management really scary and overwhelming because they don't have a go-to person, right? And building your plan and training on these things allows small shops to have really a de facto marketing department because you're training your office person who's answering the phone, or you're training your volunteers as de facto marketing people, and you feel comfortable about what they're allowed to say and you feel comfortable about what they're not allowed to say, so you don't have to scramble at the end of either a crisis or an opportunity to kind of share your story about how awesome you are.
Absolutely. And that's ultimately what it comes down to is, I'm a believer in transparency. I'm always a believer in transparency. You should be able to speak confidently about what your organization does, about their operations, their guidelines, and why they do things. But some volunteers may not understand all the inner workings of that. So it's important, I think, to recognize when things get technical, when they work that way, of what they're qualified to speak to and what they're not. But the one thing that I think everybody's qualified to speak to, and the reason why they're a part of your organization, whether it's a paid staff or volunteer, or whoever it may be, is the mission. Yeah. As long as everybody can speak to the mission, I think in that regard, you're okay. But when you start getting into the weeds on some things about finances and those types of situations, that's where you have to be careful.
Yeah. Well, and I think this also empowers them to feel comfortable about talking to anybody, anywhere, and about anything. When they have a tree that decides what I can and cannot talk about and where I go, now they feel as comfortable as you would having a conversation about sports or books, because it's just part of your training that you've done, so that you know instantaneously without questioning, can I mention about board governance and the policies that you don't have to worry about that because you already know.
Right, exactly right. I think that's the most important part, is just having the conversation and talking about it. And like you said, as long as it's a part of the training, it's a part of what you go through, then there's no deer in headlights situations that happen to you. And if there's somebody that's new to the organization, still learning some of those things, that's okay. I mean, we've all probably said something that is not 100% accurate, And that's understandable as people get to learn, but it's one of those things where you just have to learn from some of your mistakes and some of the things you say as well.
Yeah, that's really good. So I think that actually is a really good transition into what else we need to prepare. So not only talking points, not only training, but let's go through triage. We'll get a good Red Cross word in there, triage. So what kind of triage can we do? Let's just say if a crisis happens. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, one of your clients gets hurt at an activity off campus at your organization. And somebody says something. What would you suggest in a crisis management to get triage down on maybe one or two or three things that you can do right away to stem the bleeding of whatever's going to be coming out about whatever happened?
Quick communication about exactly what the situation was to whoever a supervisor is, and then whether that needs to go to the top levels. You have to have a plan in place on how quickly that communication gets relayed. How is that communication getting relayed? Is it via phone? Is there a system that you use electronically to determine that? Is this something that you have to call someone in the middle of the night because it's that significant of a situation where media might be calling and right away on it?
Right.
Everything is happening now. So you have to have a plan in place on who gets called in certain situations based on what happens, depending on what your mission is and how you're going to handle that.
Right.
And ultimately, for me, you always have to have at least someone that is willing to be on call if there is the potential for something bad to happen.
Yeah.
And I know for some nonprofits, that's a major challenge because that might mean 24 hours a day. Now, that doesn't mean you're always going to get a call 24 hours a day. You may get it once a year. You may get it once every 6 months, but you need to be prepared for it. And that's where I think it's important to have those conversations and talk about how you're going to handle that now.
Yeah.
In terms of who's going to be this person. And the last thing that you want is that the person that gets called by the media or gets called by anybody is not aware of the situation, yet the media is. That's what you definitely want to avoid.
Yes.
That conversation, communications needs to happen rapidly, and there needs to be a plan in place how you want to handle that.
Right. And going back to, this is just preparation. Hopefully you never have to use this stuff. But just like a fire drill and just like everything else, this is just something that you should have in the hopper that you can pull off the shelf or pull up on your computer and go, okay, what's my first step? What's my second step? And what's my third step? Anything that organizations should just avoid at all costs. That one thing that you just kind of sticks out in your brain of like, listen, if you do nothing else during crisis or during some thing, just don't do this.
Don't speak if you don't know. Just say, we are monitoring the situation. We are working with our employees. We're working with law enforcement. We're working with whoever the situation may be to determine what happened and figure out and work with them to try to come to a solution and rectify the situation as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. And that's the only statement that frankly you can give. The one thing I try to avoid at all costs when you say is no comment. Yeah. Try to avoid saying no comment.
Okay. Great.
No comment to me is just a very blunt, harsh, bad way. The one thing you always want to say is, we are working to try to determine to see what happened. We will update you with information as soon as we are allowed to do so. That's a much better way of saying it because it buys you time to get everything organized, get everything straight before you have some sort of response, if you can even make a response.
Right.
If it's determined later down the line, look, we cannot respond to this situation for confidentiality purposes, mm-hmm. or law enforcement purposes, or whatever the case may be in a certain circumstance, mm-hmm. then you can at least be transparent about that. But the no comment to me thing, that always gets to be a little bit dicey because that does make it look like you're hiding something.
It really does. I think, and in an environment now that is so full of sound bites, that the phrase "no comment" out of context, it just looks like you've been rushed out of a jail, or you've got people near you and you're getting into a car and you're brushing aside any concern that somebody has. It does sound dismissive, that you've got something to hide. That is interesting that if you just do that. And there's so many alternate words to use. It's we don't know right now. And again, this goes back to the talking points. What should you say in a situation where you do not know or can't give a comment? Practice that.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing, Patrick, that when you're talking to people is the one thing you don't want to look like is that you don't care.
Yeah.
Whether it's your fault or not, you still want to make it look like you care because ultimately it is your organization and your organization's reputation at stake, no matter what the situation is. So you always want to make it look like we are working on this. We do care. We do want to find what happened. But right now, we just can't speak to it because we don't have all the information and we have to work with the proper authorities, whoever that may be, our board, our CEO, other external members, other families, whoever is involved, and try to figure out everything before we formulate what the response and reaction is going to be.
Yeah, you almost have to now think of it differently in this age of the internet, where everybody will take it out of context because they can. Like you said, like you led to believe earlier, where people aren't going to call your office and complain. They're going to go to Twitter and they're going to go to Facebook and they're going to start riling up everybody else, which leads to there are trolls amongst us and they exist on the internet and they are terrible people. And there are some people who just want to watch the world burn. What can we do as an organization, as a nonprofit, to address or talk about or deal with people who just scour the internet and say mean things for the sake of saying mean things?
You know, in most situations, Patrick, I would tell you if they're completely baseless is to not even waste your time responding, because if you respond and they respond and you respond and they respond, it just turns into this wheel.
Yes.
So if you're under fire, if you have a certain situation going on, you can't respond to every single person that goes after you. All you can talk about is your story, and you just use that on your platforms to talk about, okay, here's what we really actually do. You know, if anybody has a bad experience, please contact us. We're going to try to work with that person to figure out what went wrong, what happened.
Yeah.
But responding, I think, unless it's a legitimate question from people's like, where do I drop off a donation? Where do I go for this? Or can you direct me where I get services? I think those are cordial conversations, because a lot of people reach out through Messenger, through direct messages, through whatever the case may be, to try to just get information, because that's easier now than trying to find a phone number or an email address. So that, I think those are okay. But when people are just trying to get a rise out of you, to me, those are circumstances I just try to avoid at all costs, because it really serves you no purpose to get into a baseless argument with somebody where you're not going to come to any sort of solution.
Right. And, and the other thing too is that if there are trolls out there and there are, let's just say you're in a crisis situation at the time and you're being interviewed, there's always the fear of being recorded on the supercomputer that's sitting in your pocket and your answers. And it led me right to that thought of, if you're giving answers that are well thought out and well trained on, anything that somebody records you doing and you're shedding a positive light and you're talking about things about what you're positively doing, there is a less of a chance they can use what their natural instinct is to let's record everything and post it with no context. There's less of a chance that negative context rather than it just becomes a thing and it just kind of goes away, right?
I totally agree with you on that. And that kind of leads me down to the other point, that there is no off the record. Don't ever get yourself caught in a situation, well, off the record this. Don't off the record anything, because you don't know who's listening. And all it takes is one person to talk to another person, and something off the record all of a sudden becomes on the record pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So that's a situation you got to be mindful of. It is who you're talking to. How well do you know this person, and and all those sorts of circumstances. So it's a delicate walk. Yeah. But you want to be transparent, but at the same time, you got to be very careful.
Yeah. So let's just say crisis averted, crisis ended. You came through it swimmingly. You had your talking points because you were prepped. You trained your staff. You had them say the right things at the right time. And there's still sort of this underlying uneasiness of whatever that crisis or thing happened. What sort of steps can an organization take after the dust has settled to kind of reach back out? And I know every situation is unique and different, but are there just general steps or general rules to addressing it, or do you just ignore it and move on with your life, or do you sort of lay out the groundwork, or do you go on the offense to local media, regional media, kind of or your own volunteers to discuss? Any sort of thoughts on that?
I think it's always important to do a follow-up. And whether that's just internal, is just re-walk yourself through the organization and say, let's talk about this, let's move past this and figure out if we can improve this process or this situation so it doesn't become an issue again in the future. Do you need to have any sort of future statement because you said, back 2 weeks ago that you were still trying to find a solution to this? Do you need to go public with some sort of solution that you want to do with whoever is alienated or wherever the crisis may be to make sure that people understand that a situation has been handled or been rectified or people are feeling good about whatever the result may be? And that's something that you have to talk about as a team. And then I think the other part of that is trying to get a lot of the people that work for you or that are part of your organization is try to get them back to business as usual organizationally and realizing that yes, something bad happened, but we have to learn from it, move past it, and get back to doing the work that we believe in, that we know, and try to get a lot of that issue isn't necessarily the outside world. It's your own internal team sometimes that can be shook by that. And sometimes they start questioning their beliefs. Are we doing the right thing here? Yeah. And I think it's almost more important to get your team back on track again, saying, here's what we've done to fix this. Let's move forward. Let's make sure we don't do this again. This doesn't happen again in the future. And then at least if you do that, everybody gets back to work and you hope to get back in the same routine you had before the situation arose.
Right. That's awesome. I literally can't believe that 25 minutes has just blown past because this is such an amazing topic. And again, I don't think a lot of people think about it until that thing happens. It's kind of like whatever emergency plan you had at home. You probably didn't plan on your kitchen burning down in a fire, but if you have a plan for it, at least you're better prepared. And I think talking about having the talking points ready is such a crucial thing. I think that's so great. The training, it doesn't have to be you don't have to do this every day, but just be upfront about what that training is. Prepping possible problems is such a key thing. And just, again, know off the record, giving it's okay to say I don't know, and then just I can't speak to that. But what wonderful things that you've given the nonprofit world. This is just fan-freaking-tastic.
Awesome. Good. I'm glad. Hopefully it is helpful. People can get something from it. And we have a lot of nonprofits out there that do just tremendous work, Patrick. And you don't want this one situation to define whatever the nonprofit is. So that's the best part of this is 98, 99, 99.9% of the time they're doing just great work out there and helping a lot of people. And that's what we have to remember.
Yeah, that's awesome. You have been a marvelous joy just to talk about a subject that nobody talks about that can be kind of confusing and scary. So, Brian, I cannot thank you enough for the time. I will link all the things so people can watch you on all sorts of channels this upcoming season. And if they can they want to get a hold of you and say, hey, thanks, we'll drop links down below. And thank you so much for making this it's an amazing guest expert training.
No, glad to be a part of it. And thanks for what you do too, man. It's great to have this information out there for everybody.
I love it. Brian Shawn, everybody, Midco Sports Network. Hey, Boys with Bryson as well. Joining us talking about crisis management via social media and all sorts of other things. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time, everybody.